My name is Chen, and at 26 years old, I learned that sometimes the most expensive lesson in life comes free of charge. Last month, my own family humiliated me at what was supposed to be our annual reunion dinner, kicking me out for wearing clothes they deemed too shabby for their precious reputation. They had no idea that parked outside in their pristine driveway sat a car worth more than most people's houses. If you want to know what happened when they discovered the truth about who I really am, and how their world came crashing down in the most spectacular way possible, keep watching. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding my family dynamics is crucial to appreciating just how satisfying this story becomes. I grew up in what most people would consider a picture-perfect upper-middle-class household in the affluent suburb of Maple Ridge, just outside Seattle. My father, David Chen, was a successful investment banker who wore his achievements like armor, and my mother, Patricia, was a former beauty queen turned social influencer who treated every public appearance like a runway show. My older brother, Marcus, now 32, had always been the golden child. From the moment he could walk, he was groomed to follow in our father's footsteps. Expensive private schools, tennis lessons, yacht club memberships, the works. My younger sister Vivian, 23, was the princess of the family, blessed with our mother's stunning looks and an Instagram following that made her feel like royalty. Then there was me, the middle child, who never quite fit the mold they had carefully crafted for the Chen family image. While Marcus excelled in business and Vivian basked in social media fame, I was the one asking uncomfortable questions about why we needed a third vacation home when there were homeless people sleeping under bridges just 20 minutes from our neighborhood. I was the kid who got in trouble for giving my lunch money to classmates who couldn't afford cafeteria food, the teenager who wanted to volunteer at animal shelters instead of attending charity galas where rich people wrote tax-deductible checks and patted themselves on the back. My parents never understood my perspective, and frankly, they didn't try very hard. During family dinners, the conversation would revolve around Marcus's latest business acquisition or Vivian's brand partnerships, while my achievements in social work and community organizing were met with polite nods and quick subject changes. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in social work from University of Washington, my father's response was to ask when I planned to get a real job that actually paid well. The disconnect became even more pronounced after college, when I took a position at Harbor House, a nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless individuals and families. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover rent on my small studio apartment in a working-class neighborhood called Greenwood. My family saw this as a temporary detour before I came to my senses and joined the family business or married someone with appropriate social standing. What they didn't know, and what I had never told them, was that my modest lifestyle was entirely by choice. 3 years ago, while working late at Harbor House, I had encountered an elderly man named Robert Morrison, who had been living on the streets for several months after losing his apartment. Robert was different from many of our regular clients. He was articulate, well-educated, and carried himself with a dignity that poverty couldn't diminish. Over several weeks of conversations, Robert revealed his story. He had been a brilliant software engineer who had developed a revolutionary algorithm for data compression in the early days of the internet. However, due to a series of bad business partnerships and legal battles, he had lost the rights to his innovations and ended up with nothing. Despite his circumstances, Robert had continued refining his work in notebooks and on public library computers. One evening, as I was helping Robert navigate the social services system, he showed me his latest breakthrough. His new algorithm could compress video data to a fraction of its original size while maintaining perfect quality. Having minored in computer science and understanding the implications, I recognized the potential immediately. But Robert, now in his 70s and battling health issues, felt overwhelmed by the prospect of trying to commercialize his invention again. I proposed a partnership. Using my small savings and a loan against my future inheritance, I would handle the business side while Robert refined the technical aspects. We spent months working together, with me learning everything I could about his algorithm, while he taught me the intricacies of software development. Robert insisted that if our venture succeeded, I should receive the majority ownership, since I was taking all the financial risk and doing the business development. Our breakthrough came when I managed to secure a meeting with Elena Vasquez, the CTO of a major streaming platform called FlowStream. Elena immediately recognized the revolutionary nature of Robert's algorithm and its potential to save her company millions in bandwidth costs. After a series of negotiations that stretched over 6 months, FlowStream acquired our algorithm for an upfront payment of $47 million, plus ongoing royalties that were projected to generate another $30 to $50 million over the next decade. Robert, true to his word, insisted I take 60% of the proceeds. After taxes and paying back my loan, I found myself with approximately $28 million in various accounts. Robert used his share to purchase a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood and finally received the medical care he desperately needed. He became like a grandfather to me, and we maintained a close friendship until his peaceful passing just 6 months after our deal closed. The sudden wealth was overwhelming and honestly terrifying. I had grown up with money, but this was different. This was mine, earned through my own work and judgment, not inherited or given. After consulting with financial advisors and spending weeks researching options, I made a decision that would have horrified my family if they had known about it. I put the vast majority of my windfall into carefully chosen investments and set up an anonymous foundation dedicated to addressing homelessness and poverty. I kept enough liquid cash to live comfortably but modestly, purchasing a few strategic assets that would appreciate over time. One of those assets was a 2023 Bugatti Chiron Supersport, a limited edition hypercar worth approximately $4.7 million. I had always been fascinated by automotive engineering, and this particular car represented the pinnacle of technological achievement in the industry. However, I rarely drove the Bugatti, keeping it stored in a climate-controlled garage across town. My daily driver remained a 10-year-old Honda Civic that perfectly matched my carefully maintained image as a struggling social worker. I continued living in my modest apartment, shopping at thrift stores, and maintaining the lifestyle that allowed me to connect authentically with the people I served at Harbor House. My family remained completely unaware of my financial situation. To them, I was still their disappointing daughter who had chosen idealism over practicality, purpose over profit. They frequently made comments about my lifestyle choices, with my mother regularly offering to take me shopping for clothes that wouldn't embarrass the family, and my father periodically forwarding job listings for corporate positions that paid better than nonprofit work. The annual Chen family reunion dinner had been a tradition for as long as I could remember. Every year in late November, the extended family would gather at my parents' sprawling home in Bellevue for what my mother called an elegant.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Evening of connection and gratitude. In reality, these gatherings were elaborate displays of wealth and achievement, where family members competed to showcase their latest acquisitions, accomplishments, and social connections. This year's dinner promised to be particularly extravagant because my parents had recently completed a massive renovation of their home, adding a wine cellar, a chef's kitchen, and a formal dining room that could seat 24 people. My mother had been planning the menu and decorations for months, hiring a professional event coordinator to ensure everything met her exacting standards. The guest list included not just immediate family but also aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who moved in the same social circles. My mother's sister Caroline would be there with her husband, who owned a chain of luxury car dealerships. My father's brother Robert and his wife, who collected modern art and owned properties in 3 states. Various cousins who worked in tech, finance, and real estate, all eager to discuss their latest successes and acquisitions. As the date approached, I found myself dreading the event more than usual. The past year had been particularly challenging at Harbor House, with increased demand for services due to the economic uncertainty and rising housing costs in Seattle. I had been working 12-hour days, often skipping meals and losing sleep as we struggled to help more people with limited resources. The contrast between my daily reality and my family's bubble of privilege felt more stark than ever. The day of the dinner, I finished a particularly difficult shift at Harbor House. We had been helping a family of 4 who had been evicted from their apartment and were living in their car. The mother, Jessica, was pregnant with their 3rd child, and the father, Michael, had been laid off from his construction job 2 months earlier. Despite applying for dozens of positions, he hadn't been able to find steady work that paid enough to cover rent deposits and moving costs. I had spent the afternoon helping them navigate the complex application process for emergency housing assistance, calling contacts at various agencies, and coordinating with local churches that might have temporary shelter space. By the time I left work, I was emotionally drained and running late for the family dinner. I rushed home to my apartment and quickly changed clothes. My wardrobe consisted mainly of practical, comfortable pieces suitable for my work environment. Jeans, simple sweaters, sturdy shoes that could handle walking through various neighborhoods at all hours. I had some nicer clothes, but nothing that would meet my family's expectations for formal events. I grabbed a black sweater that I had bought at a thrift store for $15, paired it with dark jeans that had a small patch on one knee, and threw on my reliable old boots. Looking in the mirror, I realized I probably should have planned better. The sweater was slightly oversized and showed some signs of wear, and the jeans were clearly not designer quality. But I was already 30 minutes late, and I knew my mother would be furious if I delayed any longer. I grabbed my purse, a simple canvas bag I had been using for years, and headed out to my Honda Civic. The drive to my parents' house in Bellevue took 45 minutes in evening traffic. As I pulled into their neighborhood, I passed the familiar landmarks of my childhood. Perfectly manicured lawns, elaborate fountains, cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries parked casually in circular driveways. The contrast with the neighborhoods I worked in every day was jarring, but I had grown used to moving between these two worlds. My parents' house sat on 2 acres at the end of a private road, a sprawling contemporary mansion with floor-to-ceiling windows and architectural details that had been featured in regional design magazines. The circular driveway was already full of luxury vehicles. I recognized my brother's new Tesla Model S Plaid, my sister's bright pink Range Rover Evoque that she had received as a graduation gift, and several other expensive cars belonging to various relatives and family friends. I parked my Honda Civic at the end of the line, acutely aware of how out of place it looked among the collection of BMWs, Mercedes, and Porsches. The car was clean and well-maintained, but its age and modest price point made it stand out like a rusty nail in a jewelry box. I took a deep breath, grabbed my purse, and walked toward the front entrance. The house was buzzing with activity as I approached the oversized mahogany front doors. Through the windows I could see elegantly dressed family members mingling in the foyer, champagne glasses in hand, air kisses being exchanged as people admired each other's outfits and jewelry. The warm glow of the interior lighting highlighted the expensive artwork on the walls, and the fresh floral arrangements that had undoubtedly cost more than many families spent on groceries in a month. I rang the doorbell and waited, smoothing down my thrift store sweater and hoping I could slip in quietly without drawing too much attention to my appearance. The door opened to reveal my mother, Patricia, dressed in a stunning navy blue cocktail dress that probably cost more than I earned in a month. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and she wore a diamond necklace that caught the light beautifully. Her expression shifted from welcoming hostess smile to barely concealed horror as she took in my appearance. Her eyes traveled from my worn boots up to my patched jeans, lingered disapprovingly on my thrift store sweater, and finally settled on my face with a look that could have frozen champagne. "Maya," she said quietly, her voice tight with controlled irritation. "You're late, and you're dressed like you're going to clean houses, not attend a family dinner." I had specifically mentioned that tonight's gathering was formal. She glanced nervously over her shoulder at the other guests before stepping closer and lowering her voice even further. "Do you have anything else to wear in your car? Perhaps something more appropriate for the occasion?" I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment and frustration. I had been dealing with real problems all day, helping families facing homelessness and hunger, and here was my mother treating my clothing choices like a personal affront to her reputation. "I'm sorry I'm late, Mom. I had an emergency at work and didn't have time to go shopping for a new outfit. This is what I have, and it's clean and presentable." My mother's jaw tightened, and I could see her internal struggle between her desire to maintain appearances and her reluctance to create a scene that other guests might overhear. Before she could respond, my brother Marcus appeared behind her, looking impeccable in his tailored charcoal suit and Italian leather shoes. His expression mirrored our mother's disapproval as he surveyed my appearance. "Jesus, Maya," Marcus said with his characteristic lack of tact. "Did you get mugged on the way over here? You look like you've been living under a bridge." He chuckled at his own joke, apparently oblivious to how cruel his words were, given my daily work with people who actually were experiencing homelessness. The comment stung more than I cared to admit, not because I was ashamed of my appearance, but because it highlighted just how disconnected my family was from the reality that millions of people faced every day. The clothes I was wearing were practical and comfortable, chosen for durability and function rather than fashion. They represented my values and my commitment to living authentically rather than performing wealth for the benefit of others. My mother placed her hand on my arm, her grip firmer than necessary. "Maya, sweetie, perhaps you could run home quickly and change into something more suitable? I'm sure the other guests would understand if you needed a few minutes to freshen up." The way she said freshen up made it clear that she considered my entire appearance to be a problem that needed solving. Before I could respond, my sister Vivian appeared, stunning as always in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, and her makeup looked like it had been applied by a professional artist. She took one look at me and barely suppressed a laugh. "Oh wow, Maya," Vivian said with fake concern. "Are you okay? You look like you've been working at a soup kitchen all day." She paused dramatically before adding, "Oh wait, isn't that basically what you do?" She giggled at her own wit while our mother shot her a warning look. The cruelty of her comment was breathtaking. I did work with people who relied on soup kitchens and food banks, and I considered it meaningful, important work that made a real difference in people's lives. But to Vivian, it was apparently a punchline, something to mock rather than respect. I could feel other guests beginning to notice the commotion in the foyer. Conversations were becoming quieter as people turned to observe what was happening at the front door. My face burned with embarrassment, not because of my clothes, but because of how my family was treating me in front of others. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I came here to spend time with family, not to participate in a fashion show. These are the clothes I have, and they're perfectly fine. If my appearance is such a problem, maybe I should just leave." My mother's eyes flashed with something between panic and anger. The last thing she wanted was for me to cause a scene that would reflect poorly on her perfectly orchestrated evening. She glanced around at the other guests, many of whom were now openly staring at our family drama. My father chose that moment to join the conversation, his businessman's instincts kicking in as he assessed the situation. Chen was a master of damage control, skilled at managing optics and maintaining the family's reputation in social and business circles. He took one look at me and immediately understood the problem from his perspective. "Maya," he said with forced joviality, trying to diffuse the tension while simultaneously addressing what he saw as the issue. "You look tired, sweetheart. Perhaps you've been working too hard at that charity of yours. Why don't you head home and get some rest? We can catch up another time when you're feeling more yourself." The dismissiveness in his tone was unmistakable. He wasn't concerned about my well-being. He was concerned about how my presence might affect his evening and his reputation among the other guests. To him, I wasn't his daughter who had been working hard to help people in need. I was a liability that needed to be managed and removed. "That charity of yours," he had said, as if my work at Harbor House was some kind of hobby rather than a professional career that I had chosen deliberately. The condescension in his voice made my stomach clench with familiar frustration. My Aunt Carolyn had joined the group by this point, her perfectly coiffed head tilted in what she probably thought was sympathetic concern. She was dressed in a cream-colored designer ensemble that screamed old money elegance, complete with pearls that had probably been in the family for generations. "Oh, honey," Caroline said in a voice dripping with false sympathy, "I know money can be tight when you're working in the non-profit sector. If you need help with some nicer clothes, I'd be happy to take you shopping. There are some lovely discount stores that have very reasonable options for work attire." The offer was clearly meant to be helpful in her mind, but it felt patronizing and humiliating. The assumption that I couldn't afford better clothes, that I needed charity from family members, that my appearance was somehow a reflection of financial struggle rather than personal choice, made my anger start to simmer beneath the surface. More family members had gathered now, drawn by the commotion and curious about what was happening. I could see cousins whispering to each other, their expressions ranging from amused to uncomfortable. Some looked genuinely sympathetic, but others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle of the family's black sheep being put in her place. My Uncle Robert, Caroline's husband, attempted to lighten the mood with what he probably thought was good-natured teasing. "Well, at least we know Maya's staying humble," he said with a chuckle. "Can't accuse her of putting on airs or forgetting where she came from, though perhaps she's taking the whole starving artist thing a bit too literally." The laughter from some of the other family members felt like physical blows. Here I was, someone who had actually achieved something meaningful, who had built a successful career helping others, and had accumulated wealth beyond most people's wildest dreams, being mocked for my appearance and assumed financial status. My mother had clearly reached her limit. She stepped closer to me, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow managed to carry more venom than if she had shouted. "Maya, you are embarrassing this family. This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes people question our values and our social standing. You need to leave now, before you make this any worse." The finality in her tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a suggestion or a request, it was an ultimatum. My own mother was kicking me out of a family gathering because my thrift store sweater and secondhand jeans didn't meet her standards for public presentation. I looked around at the faces of my family members, searching for any sign of support or understanding. Marcus looked smugly satisfied, as if my humiliation validated his position as the golden child. Vivian was still smirking, probably already composing the Instagram story she would post about her sister's fashion disaster. My father was checking his phone, clearly eager to return to entertaining his guests, and pretending this awkward family moment had never happened. The cousins and extended family members were a mix of uncomfortable witnesses and entertained spectators. Some looked away, embarrassed to be witnessing such a cruel display, while others seemed to be enjoying the drama. No one spoke up in my defense. No one questioned whether maybe, just maybe, the way I was being treated was wrong. In that moment, standing in the foyer of the house where I had grown up, surrounded by people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The rejection wasn't just about my clothes. It was about everything I represented that didn't fit their narrow definition of success and respectability. "Fine," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly in the suddenly silent foyer. "I'll leave. But before I do, I want all of you to remember this moment. Remember how you treated me, how you judged me, how you decided that what I was wearing was more important than who I am or what I've accomplished." I turned toward the door, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for the handle. My mother's voice stopped me just as I was about to step outside. "Maya," she called out, her tone slightly softer now, as if she was realizing that perhaps she had gone too far. "You know we love you, this isn't about that. It's just that appearance matters in our social circle, and we want what's best for you." I turned back to face her, feeling tears of frustration and hurt starting to well up in my eyes. "What's best for me, Mom? Or, what's best for your reputation? Because from where I'm standing, those seem to be two very different things." Without waiting for an answer, I walked out the front door and let it close behind me with a soft click that felt like the final punctuation mark on a relationship that had been deteriorating for years. As I walked toward my Honda Civic, I could hear the conversation resuming inside the house, voices becoming animated again as the family moved past the uncomfortable moment and returned to their celebration. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, and fighting back tears of anger and disappointment. Then I remembered something that made a small smile cross my face despite everything. I pulled out my phone and opened the app that controlled my garage across town. With a few taps, I initiated the process of having my Bugatti Chiron delivered to my parents' Mapa house. The car transport service I used was discreet and professional, capable of delivering the vehicle anywhere in the Seattle area within 2 hours. I sent a quick message to the service. "Please deliver the Chiron to 847 Maple Ridge Drive, Bellevue. Park it prominently in the circular driveway. Include all documentation proving ownership under Maya Chen." I'll collect it tomorrow morning. As I drove away from my parents' house, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Hurt and anger, certainly, but also a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in my adult life, I had been completely honest about how their treatment made me feel. I had called out their hypocrisy and their cruelty without trying to minimize it or make excuses for their behavior. The tears came as I drove through the dark streets of Bellevue, past the familiar landmarks of my privileged childhood. I cried for the little girl who had always felt like she didn't quite belong in her own family. I cried for the young woman who had tried so hard to win approval and acceptance from people who seemed determined to withhold it. And I cried for the relationships that might never be repaired after tonight. But underneath the sadness, there was something else growing. A sense of anticipation about what would happen when my family discovered the truth about who I really was and what I had accomplished. They had judged me based on appearances, made assumptions about my financial status, and dismissed my life choices as naive and impractical. Tomorrow morning, they would wake up to find a $4.7 million hypercar sitting in their driveway with my name on the title. They would finally understand that their struggling, poorly dressed daughter was actually wealthier than all of them combined. And they would have to confront the reality that their own prejudices and superficial values had led them to humiliate someone they should have been proud of. I drove home to my modest apartment in Greenwood, past the late-night coffee shops and small businesses that served the working-class neighborhood I had chosen to call home. Despite having more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, I genuinely loved this community and the authentic connections I had built here. My neighbors didn't care about designer clothes or luxury cars. They cared about kindness, reliability, and showing up for each other during difficult times. As I climbed the stairs to my small studio apartment, I felt grateful for the life I had built for myself, separate from my family's expectations and judgments. I had meaningful work that made a difference in people's lives. I had genuine friendships based on shared values rather than social status. And I had the financial security to live according to my principles rather than being forced to compromise them for survival. My phone buzzed with text messages as I got ready for bed. Most were from family members, but none were apologies. Marcus had sent a message saying, "I hope you're happy with yourself for ruining Mom's dinner party." Vivian had written, "Maya, you really need to grow up and stop acting like a victim all the time." The lack of self-awareness in their messages was staggering. They had humiliated me publicly, kicked me out of a family gathering, and were now angry that I hadn't simply accepted their treatment with gratitude. In their minds, I was the problem for not conforming to their expectations, not them for treating me cruelly. I turned off my phone and went to bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring a reckoning that my family couldn't possibly anticipate. They had shown me exactly how they saw me and how much they valued our relationship. Now it was time for them to learn who I really was and perhaps more importantly, who they really were. I woke up the next morning to my alarm at 6:30, just like any other workday. The events of the previous evening felt surreal in the morning light, like a bad dream that lingers at the edges of consciousness. But the hurt was still there, sharp and real, settling in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. I made coffee in my small kitchen, the familiar routine grounding me as I prepared for another day at Harbor House. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the night, but I had kept it on silent. Now, in the quiet of my apartment, I finally looked at the growing list of notifications. More messages from family members, none apologetic. All variations on the theme that I had somehow wronged them by not gracefully accepting their humiliation. My cousin Jessica, Caroline's daughter, had sent the longest message. "Maya, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but your behavior last night was really inappropriate. Aunt Patricia worked so hard to make everything perfect, and you showed up looking like you didn't even care about the family. Everyone was talking about it after you left. You owe everyone an apology, especially your parents." The message perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with my family's perspective. In their minds, the problem wasn't that they had publicly humiliated me for my appearance. The problem was that I had failed to meet their standards and then had the audacity to be upset about their treatment. They genuinely believed that I owed them an apology for not conforming to their expectations. I deleted the messages without responding and got dressed for work. Jeans, a comfortable sweater, and my reliable boots. The same type of outfit that had caused such offense the night before. As I looked in the mirror, I felt a surge of defiance. These clothes represented who I was and what I valued: comfort, practicality, authenticity. I refused to let my family's superficial judgment make me feel ashamed of choices that aligned with my principles. The drive to Harbor House took me through several different neighborhoods, each telling its own story about Seattle's complex economic landscape. From my modest apartment building in Greenwood, past the trendy coffee shops and boutiques of Fremont, through the industrial areas where people lived in RVs and makeshift shelters, to the downtown core where Harbor House sat between a luxury high-rise and a construction site. Harbor House occupied a converted warehouse space that we had transformed into a comprehensive service center. The main floor housed our intake area, case management offices, and a large multi-purpose room where we served meals and held support groups. Upstairs were smaller meeting rooms, a computer lab where clients could search for jobs and housing, and our administrative offices. I arrived to find the parking lot already busy with activity. Our breakfast program started at 7, and people began lining up well before that. I recognized many of the faces, people I had been working with for months or even years. There was Carlos, a veteran struggling with PTSD, who came in every Tuesday for our mental health support group. Maria and her 2 young children, who had been staying in transitional housing while she completed a certification program. David, an older man whose disability benefits weren't enough to cover rent in Seattle's inflated housing market. These were the people my family would never see, never think about, never consider, when making jokes about soup kitchens and homeless shelters. Each person had a story, dreams that had been derailed by circumstances often beyond their control. Job losses, medical bankruptcies, family crises, mental health struggles, addiction issues. The causes were varied, but the need for dignity and support was universal. I spent the morning in back-to-back case management meetings, helping people navigate the complex web of services and bureaucracy that stood between them and stability. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply meaningful. Every small victory, every person we helped find housing or employment or medical care, felt like evidence that the world could be made a little bit better through persistent effort and genuine care. Around 10:30, my colleague Sandra knocked on my office door with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Maya," she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "You have some visitors downstairs. They say they're family members, and they're asking to speak with you about a car situation." My stomach dropped. Forgotten about the Bugatti delivery in the intensity of my morning work. The transport service was clearly efficient, and my family had obviously discovered the vehicle in their driveway. The fact that they had tracked me down at my workplace suggested they were both confused and angry about the situation. Sandra continued, looking concerned. "They seem pretty upset, and they're making some of our clients uncomfortable with their energy. The woman in particular is very agitated. Do you want me to tell them you're not available?" I considered the option for a moment. It would be easy to avoid this confrontation, to let them stew in their confusion and anger, while I continued with my day. But that felt cowardly, and I realized I actually wanted to face them. After years of accepting their dismissive treatment, I was ready to have an honest conversation about our relationship and their behavior. "No," I said, standing up and smoothing down my sweater. "I'll come down and talk to them. But let's use conference room B so we're not disrupting the main floor activities." I followed Sandra downstairs, my heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Through the glass doors of the main entrance, I could see my parents, Marcus and Vivian, standing in a tight cluster near their cars. They looked wildly out of place in the Harbor House parking lot, their expensive clothes and obvious discomfort marking them as outsiders, in a space designed for people facing economic hardship. My mother was gesturing animatedly while talking on her phone, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her body as if she expected someone to snatch it at any moment. My father was checking his watch repeatedly, his impatience obvious even from a distance. Marcus was leaning against his Tesla, scrolling through his phone with the air of someone who considered this entire situation beneath his attention. Vivian was taking selfies, apparently finding some way to turn even this dramatic family confrontation into content for her social media presence. I opened the door and stepped outside, immediately drawing their attention. The conversation stopped abruptly as 4 pairs of eyes fixed on me with expressions ranging from confusion to fury. "Maya," my mother said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "We need to talk. Right now." I crossed my arms, staying near the entrance to Harbor House, where I felt safe and supported. "About what, Mom?" "Don't play games with us," Marcus interjected, pushing off from his car and walking toward me. "There's a $4.7 million car sitting in our driveway with your name on the title. We know you can't afford something like that, so what kind of scam are you running?" The assumption that I must be involved in something illegal or fraudulent was both predictable and insulting. In their minds, there was no legitimate way that their struggling social worker daughter could own a vehicle worth more than most people's houses. Rather than considering that they might not know everything about my life and circumstances, they had immediately jumped to the conclusion that I was somehow involved in criminal activity. "It's not a scam," I said calmly. "The car belongs to me. I bought it legally with my own money." My father stepped forward, his businessman's instincts clearly activated. "Maya, sweetie," he said in the patronizing tone he used when he thought someone was being naive or dishonest. "We know what you earn at that charity. There's no way you could afford a car like that on a social worker's salary. So let's cut through the nonsense, and you can tell us what's really going on." The dismissiveness in his voice was infuriating. He had made assumptions about my financial situation based on his limited understanding of my life, and now he was demanding that I justify my possessions to him as if I were a child who had been caught with something that didn't belong to her. Vivian had stopped taking selfies and was now recording video, apparently planning to document this family drama for her followers. "Maya," she said with false sweetness, "just tell us the truth. Did someone give you the car? Are you in some kind of sugar daddy situation? Because that would actually make a great story for my channel." The crudeness of her suggestion, and her immediate instinct to monetize our family conflict for social media content, perfectly illustrated the values that had driven me away from them in the first place. Everything was content to Vivian. Every relationship and experience was potential material for her personal brand. "You know what?" I said, feeling my patience finally snap. "Let's go inside and have this conversation properly. But I'm warning you all right now, you're not going to like what you learn about who I really am." I turned and walked back into Harbor House, not waiting to see if they would follow. Behind me, I could hear hurried whispers and the sound of expensive shoes on concrete as they debated whether to pursue this conversation in what they clearly considered a hostile environment. Sandra was waiting near the reception desk with a sympathetic expression. "I've set up conference room B for you," she said quietly. "And Maya, if you need backup, just text me. Half the staff here would happily escort your family off the property if they get out of line." Her offer of support meant more than she could know. At Harbor House, I was valued and respected for my work and my character. My colleagues saw me as a competent professional who made a real difference in people's lives. The contrast with my family's perception of me was stark and painful. I led my family down the hallway to conference room B, past the walls covered with photos of successful program graduates, thank you letters from clients, and awards recognizing Harbor House's impact in the community. My mother's heels clicked loudly on the polished concrete floor, the sound echoing in the space designed for functionality rather than aesthetics. Conference room B was a simple space with a rectangular table, 8 chairs and windows that looked out onto the alley behind the building. It was where we held difficult conversations with clients about housing denials, benefit cuts, and other bureaucratic obstacles that stood between them and stability. It felt appropriate that this would be where I finally had an honest conversation with my family about our relationship. We sat down around the table, with me on one side and the 4 of them arrayed across from me like a tribunal. The physical arrangement felt symbolic of the us versus them dynamic that had characterized our family relationships for years. "All right," my father said, settling into his chair and fixing me with his most serious business expression. "Explain the car, Maya. And please don't insult our intelligence with some story about winning the lottery or finding a bag of money." The condescension in his tone was breathtaking. Here was my own father, automatically assuming that any explanation I might offer would be a lie or a fantasy. He couldn't conceive of a scenario where his daughter had legitimately earned the kind of money necessary to purchase a luxury vehicle. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I kept documentation of my business dealings. Screenshots of bank statements, copies of contracts, investment summaries. The evidence of a financial life that my family had never bothered to inquire about or understand. 3 years ago, I said, placing my phone on the table where they could all see the screen, I partnered with a brilliant software engineer named Robert Morrison to develop and commercialize a revolutionary data compression algorithm. We sold that algorithm to Flowstream for $47 million. After taxes and paying back my initial investment, I received approximately $28 million. The silence in the room was absolute. 4 faces stared at me with expressions of shock, disbelief, and confusion. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're lying," he said, but without his usual confidence. "There's no way you made that kind of money. We would have known about it." "Would you?" I asked, meeting his gaze directly. "When was the last time any of you asked about my work, beyond making jokes about soup kitchens? When did you ever show interest in my life or my accomplishments? You assumed I was struggling financially because I chose to live modestly, and you never bothered to investigate whether your assumptions were correct." My mother was shaking her head slowly, as if trying to physically reject the information I was presenting. "Maya, this doesn't make sense. If you had that kind of money, why would you continue living in that tiny apartment? Why would you keep working at this place for practically nothing?" "Because, Mom," I said, feeling the words I had wanted to say for years finally finding their voice, "I believe that how you live is more important than how much you own. I chose to continue working here because this job gives my life meaning and purpose. I chose to live modestly because I don't need to display my wealth to feel valuable or important." Vivian had been unusually quiet, but now she leaned forward with a calculating expression that I recognized from her social media negotiations. "Wait, Maya, if this is true, why didn't you ever tell us? Think about all the opportunities we could have created together. Brand partnerships, investment opportunities, content creation. We could have built something amazing as a family." Her immediate instinct to figure out how my success could benefit her was so perfectly characteristic that I almost laughed. Even faced with evidence that she had completely misjudged me, her first thought was how to monetize the situation for her own gain. "Because Vivian," I said sadly, "this conversation right here is exactly why I never told you. Your first instinct isn't to congratulate me or ask how I accomplished something remarkable. Your first instinct is to figure out how you can profit from my success." My father had been studying the documents on my phone with the intense focus he usually reserved for business deals. As a successful investor, he knew how to read financial statements and recognize legitimate documentation. Slowly, his expression was shifting from skepticism to something approaching awe. "Maya," he said finally, "if these numbers are accurate, you're significantly wealthier than our entire family combined. The investment portfolio alone is worth more than most people will see in a lifetime." "That's correct," I said simply. "I've been quietly managing a substantial fortune while you all assumed I was barely scraping by. I've used most of the money to establish a foundation that addresses homelessness and poverty, but I've kept enough liquid assets to live comfortably for the rest of my life." Marcus was scrolling through his own phone now, apparently trying to verify the information I had presented. He looked up with an expression of stunned recognition. "Holy shit, Maya. I found the Flowstream acquisition announcement from 3 years ago. It mentions the algorithm and the purchase price, but the seller information is confidential. That was you?" The reality was finally sinking in for all of them. Their assumptions about my life, my capabilities, and my financial situation had been completely wrong. The daughter they had dismissed as naive and impractical had quietly achieved a level of success that exceeded all of their accomplishments combined. But rather than feeling vindicated or satisfied by their shock, I found myself feeling deeply sad. This revelation shouldn't have been necessary for them to treat me with respect and dignity. My worth as a person and as a family member shouldn't have been dependent on my bank account balance. "So let me ask you something," I continued, my voice growing stronger as I finally voiced thoughts I had carried for years. "Now that you know I'm wealthy, are you going to apologize for how you treated me last night? Are you going to acknowledge that kicking me out of a family dinner because of my clothes was cruel and superficial?" My mother's face had gone pale, and I could see her mind working to process the implications of what she was learning. "Maya, honey," she said slowly, "we didn't know. If we had understood your situation, we never would have treated you that way." Her response confirmed my worst fears about my family's values. In her mind, my wealth was relevant too, how I deserved to be treated. The fact that she thought my clothes were inappropriate was apparently acceptable when she believed I was poor, but became problematic now that she knew I was rich. "That's exactly the problem, Mom," I said, feeling tears of frustration starting to build. "You're saying you would have treated me differently if you had known about my money. But why should my bank account balance determine whether I deserve basic respect and kindness from my own family?" The question hung in the air unanswered, because they couldn't answer it honestly without admitting that their love and acceptance was conditional on external markers of success rather than on genuine care for me as a person. Marcus was still processing the financial implications, his business mind clearly struggling to reconcile his perception of me with this new information. "Maya," he said finally, "you could have invested with me. My firm could have helped you diversify those assets, created even more wealth. Why didn't you come to us for financial advice?" Even now, faced with evidence of my success, he couldn't resist the urge to position himself as someone who could have helped me achieve more. The idea that I might have made smart financial decisions without his input seemed impossible for him to accept. "Because, Marcus," I said with a bitter laugh, "your advice would have been focused on maximizing profit rather than aligning my investments with my values. I've put most of my money into socially responsible investments and charitable giving because that's what matters to me. You would have tried to talk me out of that approach." Vivian had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up with a petulant tone that reminded me of her teenage years. "Maya, you could have helped all of us. Do you know how much student loan debt I'm carrying? How hard it's been to build my brand without capital investment? You've been sitting on millions of dollars while your own sister struggled to make ends meet." The entitlement in her statement was breathtaking. She had never shown any interest in my financial well-being or offered to help me when she believed I was struggling. But now that she knew I was wealthy, she immediately felt I owed her financial support. "Vivian," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "you have over 200,000 Instagram followers and multiple brand partnerships. You drive a Range Rover that costs more than most people's annual salary. By what definition are you struggling to make ends meet?" She flushed at being called out on her privilege, but doubled down on her position. "That's different. I work hard for my success, but you've been hoarding money that could have helped the whole family achieve more." The irony of her calling my work less legitimate than her social media career was stunning. I had built my wealth through innovation and business acumen, while she had built her following by posting photos of herself in expensive clothes and exotic locations. Yet in her mind, I was the one who hadn't earned my success. "Let me be very clear about something," I said, my voice taking on an edge that made them all pay attention. "I don't owe any of you money, support, or explanation for my financial decisions. The fact that I have wealth doesn't create an obligation for me to share it with family members who have spent years treating me with dismissal and contempt." My father cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Maya, I think we can all agree that there have been misunderstandings on both sides. Perhaps we should focus on moving forward and rebuilding our relationships now that we have a better understanding of everyone's situation." His attempt to reframe the conversation as mutual misunderstanding rather than one-sided mistreatment was typical of his conflict avoidance style. Rather than acknowledging the harm that had been done, he wanted to simply move past it without taking responsibility or making amends. "No, Dad," I said firmly. "There haven't been misunderstandings on both sides. You all made assumptions about me, based on superficial observations, and never bothered to learn who I really was or what I had accomplished. Then you used those assumptions to justify treating me poorly. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a failure of love and respect." The silence that followed was thick with tension and unspoken accusations. For the first time in my adult life, I had refused to minimize their behavior or accept partial responsibility for our family conflicts. I had stated clearly that they had wronged me and that their treatment had been unacceptable. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sandra. "Everything okay in there? Your 10:30 appointment is here whenever you're ready." I looked around the table at my family members, their expensive clothes and shocked expressions, and realized that this conversation had reached its natural conclusion. I had shared the truth about my life and my success. I had challenged their assumptions and called out their superficial values, but I couldn't force them to understand or accept what I was saying. "I need to get back to work," I said, standing up and gathering my phone. "I have clients depending on me, people facing real problems that require immediate attention. You all know how to find me if you want to have a genuine conversation about repairing our relationships." As I reached the door, my mother called out desperately, "Maya, wait. We love you. We want to work this out." I turned back to look at her, seeing the fear in her eyes for the first time. Not fear of losing money or social status, but fear of losing a daughter. She was just beginning to understand she had never really known. "Mom," I said gently, "love isn't just a feeling you claim to have. Love is how you treat people, especially when it's difficult or inconvenient. If you want to work things out, you need to think seriously about whether you love me for who I am, or whether you only love the version of me that fits your expectations." I left them sitting in conference room B and walked back to my office, passing the framed photos of Harbor House success stories and community partnerships that lined the hallway. These were reminders of work that mattered, relationships built on genuine care and mutual respect, achievements that couldn't be measured in dollars but changed lives in measurable ways. My 10:30 appointment was Carlos, the veteran I had mentioned earlier. He was waiting in my office with the patient dignity that characterized so many of our clients, men and women, who had learned to navigate systems that often treated them as problems rather than people. "Carlos," I said, settling into my chair and pushing thoughts of my family drama to the back of my mind. "How are you doing? How did the job interview go yesterday?" For the next hour, I focused entirely on helping Carlos navigate the challenges of finding stable employment while managing PTSD symptoms. We discussed disclosure strategies, workplace accommodations, and backup plans if this particular opportunity didn't work out. It was meaningful work that required my full attention and expertise. As Carlos was leaving, he paused at my office door. "Miss Maya," he said with the formal courtesy that made him such a pleasure to work with, "I don't know what was going on with those folks earlier, but I want you to know that everyone here sees how hard you work for us. You're good people, and don't let anybody tell you different." His words hit me harder than I expected, bringing tears to my eyes that I had been holding back all morning. Here was someone who truly saw me, who valued me for my character and my actions rather than my appearance or my bank account. The contrast with my family's treatment was stark and painful. I spent the rest of the morning in client meetings, helping people navigate housing applications, benefit renewals, and job search strategies. Each conversation reminded me why I had chosen this work, and why I continued to find it meaningful despite having the financial freedom to do anything else with my life. Around noon, Sandra knocked on my door again. "Your family left about an hour ago," she said, "but they were standing in the parking lot arguing for quite a while before they drove off. Are you okay? Do you need to talk about what happened?" I appreciated her concern, but I wasn't ready to process the morning's events with anyone yet. "I'm okay," I said. "It was just some family drama that needed to be addressed. Thank you for covering for me during the meetings." She nodded and started to leave, then turned back with a thoughtful expression. "Maya, I don't know what your family situation is, but I want you to know that you have another family here. People who see your value and appreciate everything you do. Don't forget that." After she left, I sat in my office thinking about her words. She was right that I had found a chosen family at Harbor House, colleagues and clients who valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with wealth or status. But the rejection from my biological family still hurt in ways that professional relationships couldn't fully heal. My phone had been buzzing periodically throughout the morning with text messages from various family members. I finally looked at them during my lunch break, curious to see how they were processing the morning's revelations. Marcus had sent several messages, his tone shifting from disbelief to calculation as he absorbed the financial implications. "Maya, I've been thinking about investment strategies that could help you maximize your returns while still supporting your charitable goals. We should meet this week to discuss portfolio optimization." Even after learning that I had successfully managed millions of dollars for 3 years, he couldn't resist the urge to position himself as someone who could help me make better financial decisions. The assumption that I needed his expertise despite evidence of my own competence was both predictable and insulting. Vivian's messages were more emotional but equally self-serving. Maya, I'm sorry if I seemed insensitive earlier. I'm just overwhelmed by all of this. But I really think we could do amazing things together now that I understand your situation. Imagine the content we could create, the causes we could promote, the influence we could have as a team. Her apology was immediately followed by suggestions for how my wealth could enhance her social media career. The pattern was so familiar, the quick pivot from conflict to potential benefit, that it felt like a caricature of everything wrong with our relationship. My parents had sent a joint message that was longer and more thoughtful, but still revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Maya, we're both shocked and impressed by what you've accomplished. We clearly underestimated your abilities, and we're sorry for that. We'd like to take you out for a nice dinner this weekend, so we can celebrate your success properly and discuss how we can better support your goals moving forward. The offer to celebrate my success felt hollow given that they had only learned about it because they had confronted me about the car. If I hadn't been forced to reveal my financial situation, they would have continued treating me with the same dismissive attitude they had shown for years. More troubling was their suggestion that they wanted to discuss how they could support my goals. The implication was that their support was conditional on understanding and approving of my objectives, rather than offering unconditional love and acceptance regardless of my choices. I didn't respond to any of the messages. I wasn't ready to engage with their attempts to reframe our relationship now that they understood my financial status. The hurt from years of dismissive treatment couldn't be erased by a few apologetic text messages and offers of belated support. The afternoon brought a steady stream of clients and administrative tasks that kept me focused on immediate needs rather than family drama. I helped a single mother complete a housing application, connected a disabled veteran with appropriate healthcare resources, and facilitated a support group for people dealing with chronic homelessness. Each interaction reminded me of why I had chosen this work, and why I found it more meaningful than the wealth accumulation and status competition that drove my family's choices. These were people facing real challenges with courage and dignity, working to rebuild their lives with whatever resources and support they could access. As the day wound down, I realized that the morning's confrontation had crystallized something important for me. I had spent years hoping that my family would eventually see and value who I really was. I had accepted their dismissive treatment partly because I kept believing that someday they would understand and appreciate my choices. But their reaction to learning about my wealth had shown me that their love and respect was conditional on external measures of success, rather than genuine appreciation for my character and values. They were prepared to celebrate me now that they knew I was rich, but they had been equally prepared to humiliate me when they believed I was poor. That realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it freed me from the endless cycle of seeking approval that would never come in the form I needed. Heartbreaking because it confirmed that the loving, accepting family relationships I had always hoped for might simply not be possible with these particular people. As I prepared to leave Harbor House for the day, I made a decision about how to handle the situation moving forward. I would continue to be open to genuine reconciliation if my family members were willing to acknowledge their behavior and work toward real change. But I would no longer accept superficial apologies or conditional acceptance based on my financial status. The drive home took me past some of the neighborhoods where our clients lived, areas that most people drove through quickly, without really seeing the complex realities of urban poverty. But I had learned to notice the small signs of resilience and community that existed even in the most challenging circumstances. Community gardens growing in vacant lots, murals celebrating local history and culture, small businesses serving as gathering places for neighbors who looked out for each other. These communities had taught me that wealth and status were poor measures of human worth, that dignity and respect should be available to everyone, regardless of their economic circumstances. My family's treatment of me when they believed I was poor had violated those basic principles of human decency. Back in my apartment, I sat with a cup of tea and thought about the events of the past 24 hours. Less than a day ago, I had been the family disappointment, the struggling social worker whose life choices were seen as naive and impractical. Now I was suddenly someone whose success they wanted to celebrate, and whose wealth they hoped to access. The dramatic shift in their attitude revealed everything I needed to know about the superficial nature of their love and respect. They hadn't learned anything new about my character, my values, or my accomplishments as a person. They had simply learned that I had money, and that knowledge had completely transformed how they saw me. I pulled out my laptop and began drafting an email to my family, something I could send when I was ready to communicate my thoughts clearly and completely. The message needed to address their behavior, set clear boundaries for future interactions, and explain what genuine reconciliation would require from each of them. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about Robert Morrison, the homeless engineer whose algorithm had changed my life so dramatically. Robert had taught me that true worth comes from what you create and contribute, not from what you accumulate or display. He had lived with dignity and purpose, even when he had nothing, and he had used his sudden wealth to improve his life without changing his fundamental character. Robert had also taught me about the importance of choosing your partnerships carefully, surrounding yourself with superficial characteristics. The difference between his mentorship and my family's treatment was stark and instructive. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed my cousin Sarah, Caroline's youngest daughter who had always been the most genuine member of our extended family. Unlike the others, Sarah had stayed out of family drama and maintained her own independent relationships with various relatives. "Maya," she said when I answered, "I heard there was some kind of major confrontation with your parents and siblings today. Are you okay?" Her concern felt genuine, unlike the calculating messages I had received from my immediate family members. Sarah had never asked me for anything or treated me differently based on her assumptions about my financial situation. "I'm okay," I told her. "It's been a difficult day, but maybe a necessary one." Some things needed to be said that have been building up for a long time. Sarah was quiet for a moment before responding. "Maya, I don't know all the details, but I want you to know that some of us have noticed how the family treats you. It's not okay. And it's not fair. You're one of the kindest, most principled people I know, and you deserve better." Her validation meant more than I could express. For so long I had wondered if I was being oversensitive about my family's treatment, if perhaps their dismissive attitudes were normal family dynamics that I was interpreting too harshly. Having someone else acknowledge that their behavior was problematic helped me trust my own perceptions. We talked for another 20 minutes, with Sarah offering genuine support and understanding without asking probing questions about the specifics of the day's events. It was the kind of conversation I wished I could have with my immediate family members, but it reinforced my belief that real relationships were built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than obligation or shared DNA. After hanging up with Sarah, I returned to my email draft, feeling clearer about what I wanted to communicate. The message wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about setting boundaries and explaining what would be required for us to rebuild our relationships on a healthier foundation. I wrote about the years of dismissive treatment, the way they had made assumptions about my life without showing genuine interest in my experiences or accomplishments. I described how their reaction to my wealth had confirmed that their love and respect was conditional on external measures of success rather than appreciation for my character and values. Most importantly, I outlined what genuine reconciliation would require from each of them: acknowledgement of their behavior and its impact on me, genuine effort to understand and respect my choices even when they disagreed with them, consistent treatment based on who I was as a person, rather than their perceptions of my status or utility to them. The email was several pages long by the time I finished, covering years of accumulated hurt and frustration that I had never fully expressed. Reading it back, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness that our relationships had deteriorated to the point where such a message was necessary. Relief that I was finally being completely honest about my experiences and expectations. I saved the draft without sending it, knowing I wanted to sit with it for a day or two before deciding whether and how to share it with my family. The act of writing it had been cathartic, regardless of whether they ever read it. As evening approached, I made dinner and tried to focus on the positive aspects of my life. Meaningful work that aligned with my values. Financial security that allowed me to live according to my principles. Genuine friendships built on mutual respect and shared commitment to making the world better. But the hurt from my family's treatment was still there, a persistent ache that reminded me of what I had lost or perhaps never really had. The loving, supportive family relationships that I had always hoped for seemed more elusive than ever, replaced by the bitter knowledge that their love had always been conditional on my conformity to their expectations. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from my mother. Maya, your father and I have been talking all day about this morning's conversation. We realize we have a lot to learn about who you've become, and we'd really like the chance to start over. Please don't shut us out completely. The message felt more genuine than the earlier attempts at reconciliation. But I wasn't ready to respond. Starting over would require them to acknowledge specifically what they had done wrong and demonstrate consistent change in their behavior. I had learned too much about conditional love to accept superficial gestures or promises without evidence of real transformation. Instead of responding, I turned off my phone and spent the evening reading a book that Robert had recommended years ago, a biography of a social entrepreneur who had used business principles to address systemic poverty. It was a reminder that wealth and values didn't have to be opposing forces, that financial success could be used to create positive change in the world. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, I had been the family disappointment, struggling to earn their acceptance and approval. Today, I was a millionaire, who had been forced to confront the superficial nature of their love and respect. The revelation had been painful but necessary. I finally understood that the problem wasn't with my choices or my inability to meet their expectations. The problem was with their inability to love and accept me for who I really was. That knowledge was both devastating and liberating, opening up the possibility of building authentic relationships based on genuine connection rather than performance and conformity. 3 weeks passed before I heard from my family again. During that time, I threw myself into my work at Harbor House, finding solace in helping people who valued authenticity over appearances. The foundation I had established using Robert's algorithm proceeds was making real progress, funding emergency housing for 12 families, and providing job training programs that had already placed 37 people in stable employment. I had also made a decision about the Bugatti. Rather than keeping it as a symbol of my hidden wealth, I donated it to a charity auction benefiting homeless veterans. The car sold for $5.2 million, exceeding its original purchase price due to its limited production status. Carlos, the veteran I had been working with, was among the first to hear about the donation. His quiet nod of approval meant more to me than any family reconciliation ever could. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening as I was reviewing applications for our new arts therapy program. My mother's voice sounded different, smaller somehow, stripped of the confident authority she usually wielded in family conversations. Maya, she said hesitantly, I've been seeing a therapist. Dr. Richardson suggested I call you, not to ask for anything, but to listen if you're willing to share how our treatment affected you. I was surprised by her directness and the absence of her usual attempts to minimize or justify the family's behavior. The fact that she had sought professional help suggested a level of self-reflection I hadn't expected from her. Over the next hour, I found myself telling her things I had never expressed before. How her constant criticism of my appearance had made me feel invisible and unworthy. How the family's assumption that success could only be measured in dollars and status symbols had made me question my own values. How their treatment at the dinner had felt like a final rejection of everything I represented. My mother listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she was genuinely trying to understand my perspective. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Maya, I realize now that I raised you to be exactly who you are, someone with integrity and compassion, and then punished you for not being someone else. I'm ashamed of how I've treated you, and I understand if you can't forgive me right away. Her acknowledgement was more complete and honest than anything I had ever heard from her. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope that our relationship might be salvageable. The following months brought gradual changes in our family dynamics. Marcus surprised me by showing up at Harbor House one day, not to offer business advice, but to volunteer in our job training program. His MBA background proved useful in helping clients develop interview skills and understand workplace dynamics. He never mentioned my wealth or tried to leverage our relationship for business purposes. Vivian began using her social media platform to highlight the work Harbor House was doing, bringing genuine attention to homelessness issues rather than treating them as content opportunities. She quietly deleted the videos she had recorded during our family confrontation, choosing to focus her influence on causes that mattered rather than personal drama. My father remained the most resistant to change, though he eventually acknowledged that his assumptions about my capabilities had been unfair and limiting. He began attending family therapy sessions with my mother, working to understand how his business-focused worldview had damaged his relationships with his children. The breakthrough came 8 months later during a small dinner at my parents' house. No extended family, no formal dress codes, just the 5 of us around their kitchen table eating food my mother had cooked herself. When I arrived wearing jeans and a comfortable sweater, the same type of outfit that had caused such offense before, nobody commented on my appearance. Instead, the conversation focused on the work we were each doing, the challenges we were facing, and the ways we were growing as individuals. Marcus talked about how volunteering had given him perspective on privilege and responsibility. Vivian shared her struggles with using her platform meaningfully, rather than just for personal gain. My parents discussed what they were learning in therapy about conditional love and family expectations. For the first time in my adult life, I felt seen and valued by my family for who I actually was, rather than who they wanted me to be. The wealth that had initially shocked them into respect became irrelevant as they learned to appreciate my character, my values, and my choices. Near the end of the evening, my mother brought out a framed photograph she had commissioned, a picture of the entire Harbor House staff taken during our recent program graduation ceremony. I was in the center, surrounded by colleagues and clients, my face bright with genuine joy and purpose. "I wanted to remember you this way," she said simply. "Not because of what you own, but because of who you are when you're doing what you love." 6 months later, I stood before a gathering of donors, community leaders, and Harbor House clients at our annual fundraising gala. The event was being held in the renovated warehouse space we had purchased using foundation funds, transformed into a beautiful venue that reflected both elegance and accessibility. My family was there, not as reluctant attendees, but as genuine supporters of the work. Marcus had become a regular volunteer and board member. Vivian had documented the evening for her platform, creating content that highlighted our clients' achievements rather than her own involvement. My parents had made a substantial donation and were actively learning about the complexities of homelessness and poverty. As I spoke about the programs we had launched and the lives we had impacted, I caught sight of my reflection in the windows overlooking the space where Robert Morrison had once spent cold nights. I was wearing a simple black dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, not because I felt pressure to impress anyone, but because I wanted to honor the significance of the evening. The real transformation, without purpose, was meaningless. They had learned to value what I valued, to see strength in compassion and success in service to others. During the reception, I overheard my mother talking to a potential donor about the foundation's work. She spoke with genuine passion about our programs, demonstrating a deep understanding of the issues we addressed. When someone asked about her connection to the organization, she simply said, "My daughter taught me that true success is measured by the good you create in the world." Later that evening, as I drove home through the quiet streets of Seattle, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. The humiliation at my family's dinner table had ultimately led to the most honest conversations we had ever had. Their rejection of my appearance had forced me to examine whether I needed their approval to live authentically. The answer had been clearly no. I had found my worth in my work, my relationships with people who shared my values, and my commitment to using privilege responsibly. My family's eventual acceptance had been a gift, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of self-worth or belonging. My phone buzzed with a text message from Carlos, who had started his own nonprofit organization for veterans experiencing homelessness. His text was simple but profound. "Maya, thank you for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. You taught me that dignity isn't something you lose or find. It's something you choose to recognize in yourself and others." His words reminded me why I had chosen this path, and why I would continue walking it regardless of external recognition or approval. The work itself was the reward, The relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose were the true measure of success. As I pulled into my apartment complex in Greenwood, I smiled at the familiar sight of my neighborhood. The small businesses, diverse community, and authentic connections I had built here remained more valuable to me than any luxury mansion could ever be. I had learned that home wasn't about impressive addresses or expensive possessions, but about being surrounded by people who valued you for who you truly were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.